The Melungeon sisters' horrifying secret. That's what they called it in the mountain hollers of Tennessee, 1886. Two sisters, 17-year-old Ilara and 19-year-old Lilia, living where secrets stayed buried in the rocky soil. Until the day Lilia came to her sister, shaking, with news that would destroy everything they knew. She was pregnant. But the father wasn't some young man from a neighboring settlement. The father was their own uncle, Silas, a respected elder, a provider, someone their family trusted completely. Then Ilara discovered the unthinkable. She was carrying his child too. But in those isolated mountains, this horror ran deeper than anyone imagined. The old midwife whispered of other girls, other troubles quietly swept away over the years, a pattern of abuse hidden behind family loyalty and mountain silence. When Ilara finally chose to shatter that silence, she uncovered a truth that would tear their community apart. How many victims had there been, and how far would a family go to keep their darkest secrets buried? The autumn of 1886 had settled over the Tennessee mountains like a threadbare quilt, patchy with gold and rust, where the leaves still clung to their branches, bare and stark where winter had already claimed its due. In the hollow that sheltered the Gibson family, the morning mist rose from Black Creek like the breath of sleeping ghosts, and 17-year-old Ilara could taste the coming frost on her tongue as she hauled water from the well. The bucket felt heavier than usual, or perhaps it was the weight of watching her sister Lilia these past weeks, seeing how she moved through their small world like a woman walking underwater, her face pale as milk glass and twice as fragile. Their cabin sat tucked into the mountainside like a secret, weathered logs chinked with clay and moss, smoke rising thin and blue from the chimney that Ilara's grandfather had built with stones pulled from the creek bed. It was a Melungeon house, which meant it bore the particular kind of silence that came from generations of keeping to themselves, of knowing that the world beyond their hollow held little kindness for people whose skin told stories of mixing that made their white neighbors uncomfortable and whose heritage carried whispers of Cherokee blood, Portuguese sailors, and freed slaves who had found refuge in these unforgiving hills. Ilara set the bucket down with more force than necessary, water sloshing over the rim onto her worn boots. She had been watching Lilia for 3 weeks now, counting the mornings her 19-year-old sister had rushed behind the cabin to heave up whatever meager breakfast she had managed to swallow, noting how her dresses had grown tight across the chest and how she flinched whenever their Uncle Silas looked her way during his regular visits. The knowing had been building in Ilara's chest like a thunderstorm, pressure mounting until she could barely breathe around it. "Lilia," she called, her voice cutting through the morning quiet. "Come help me with this water." Her sister appeared in the doorway, backlit by the dim glow of their oil lamp, and Ilara's heart clenched at the sight of her. Lilia had always been the beauty of the family, with her smooth olive skin and dark eyes that could catch light like creek stones, but now she looked hollowed out, as if someone had carved away everything vital and left only the shell behind. She moved like she was made of spun glass, each step measured and careful, her hands pressed protectively across her middle in a gesture that confirmed what Ilara had already begun to suspect. "You're carrying," Ilara said, not a question, but a statement delivered with the flat certainty of someone who had run out of hope for any other explanation. Lilia's face crumpled like paper thrown into a fire, and she sank onto the split log step that served as their front porch, her shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from her throat. "I didn't want you to know," she whispered. "I thought maybe if I didn't say it out loud." Ilara knelt beside her sister, her own hands trembling as she reached out to stroke Lilia's hair. In their community, an unwed pregnancy was a scandal that could destroy a family's standing, could see them shunned even more completely than their mixed heritage already made them. But there were ways to handle such things quietly, discreetly. Young women sometimes disappeared for months, visiting distant relatives, returning with stories of helping with sick cousins or aging aunts. It was shameful, but not unthinkable. "Is it that boy from the Hensley settlement?" Ilara asked, thinking of the young man with the crooked smile who had caught Lilia's eye at the last harvest gathering. "The one who kept asking you to walk with him?" Lilia's sobs grew harsher, more desperate, and she shook her head violently. "No, it's not. Oh God, Ilara, you don't understand. It's not someone from outside. It's—" She lifted her face, and Ilara saw an anguish so deep it seemed to have carved new lines around her sister's eyes. "It's Uncle Silas." The words hit Ilara like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and sending ice through her veins. Uncle Silas, their father's brother, who brought them sugar and coffee when he could spare it, who had taught them to read from his worn Bible, who sat at their table every Sunday after church and spoke of family loyalty and the importance of keeping their troubles to themselves. Uncle Silas, whose hands had lingered too long when he helped them with heavy loads, whose eyes followed them when he thought no one was looking, whose gifts always came with reminders of how much they owed him, how much they needed him. "No," Ilara breathed, but even as the denial left her lips, pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Silas's increased visits over the past months, the way Lilia had, grown quiet and withdrawn, the fear that flickered in her sister's eyes whenever footsteps approached their door. "He said it was my fault," Lilia whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning bird song. "Said I tempted him, that I was wicked and shameful, and that if I told anyone, they would know what kind of girl I really was. He said Papa would cast me out, that the whole family would suffer for my sin." Ilara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a sensation like foundations cracking. She had always known that the world was hard on people like them, that their mixed blood and mountain ways marked them as outsiders even among outsiders. But this was different. This was betrayal of the deepest kind, a violation that struck at the very heart of what family was supposed to mean. "When?" she managed to ask. "It started last spring," Lilia said, her voice growing smaller with each word. "After Mama took sick and was bedridden for those weeks, he said he was just checking on us, making sure we were managing. But then he said it was natural for a man to have needs, and that family took care of family, and—" She dissolved into tears again, her whole body shaking. Ilara pulled her sister close, holding her, while her own mind raced with a terrible new possibility. Last spring. The same time that Uncle Silas had begun paying special attention to her as well, complimenting her on how she was growing into a woman, bringing her small gifts that he said were just between them. The same time she had begun to feel uncomfortable in his presence, though she had pushed those feelings down, telling herself she was being foolish and ungrateful. Now, with horrible clarity, she remembered other things. The way he had cornered her in the root cellar just 2 months ago, his hands on her shoulders, his breath hot against her ear as he spoke of how much she resembled her grandmother, how the Gibson women had always been special. The night he had stayed late, after her parents had gone to bed, sitting too close to her by the fire, his hand resting on her knee, as he told her stories of their ancestors and the importance of keeping family secrets. Her hand moved instinctively to her own belly, where she had been trying to ignore the subtle changes in her body, the missed monthly bleeding, the strange tenderness and nausea that she had attributed to worry over Lilia's condition. But now, with her sister's confession echoing in her ears, she could no longer deny what her body had been trying to tell her. "Oh, God!" she whispered, and Lilia looked up at her with fresh alarm. "What is it?" "I think—" Ilara's voice broke on the words, "I think I'm carrying too." The sisters stared at each other in horror, the full weight of their shared nightmare settling between them like a stone. They were trapped not just by their pregnancies, but by the impossible tangle of family loyalty, community expectations, and their uncle's carefully constructed web of manipulation. Silas held power in their small world. He was respected, prosperous by mountain standards, someone their parents relied on for support. To speak against him would be to invite not just his wrath, but the destruction of everything their family had built in these unforgiving hills. The morning mist was burning off now, leaving the hollow bright and clear. But for the Gibson sisters, the world had never seemed darker. The weeks that followed their shared confession passed like a fever dream, each day blending into the next, in a haze of desperate whispers and mounting terror. Lilia had retreated so far into herself that she barely spoke, moving through their daily chores like a sleepwalker, her hands constantly pressed to her belly, as if she could somehow will away what grew there. She jumped at every sound, flinched at every shadow, and when Uncle Silas made his regular visits, she would disappear into the back room and refuse to emerge until long after his footsteps had faded down the mountain path. But something different was taking root in Ilara, something that felt like anger wrapped around a core of ice-cold determination. Where Lilia shrank from the world, Ilara found herself studying it with new eyes, searching for cracks in the wall of silence that seemed to surround every woman in their hollow. She began to listen more carefully to the conversations that stopped when she approached, to watch the faces of the other women when their menfolk spoke of family matters and keeping troubles close to home. There had to be others, she reasoned. A man like Silas, with his sense of entitlement and his carefully cultivated image as a pillar of their small community, did not suddenly decide at 43 to violate his brother's daughters. This had a history, a pattern that someone, somewhere, had to know about. Her first attempt at gathering information came during the monthly quilting circle at the Mullins cabin, where 8 women from their settlement gathered to work on a wedding quilt for young Mary Hensley. Ilara had never been particularly skilled with needle and thread, but she attended faithfully because it was one of the few times the women spoke freely, their voices mixing with the steady rhythm of their stitches. That afternoon, as autumn sunlight slanted through the single window and cast their work in shades of gold, she tried to steer the conversation toward more dangerous waters. "My mama was telling me about Cousin Ruth's troubles last spring," she said carefully, referring to a distant relative whose sudden departure from the mountains had been explained as a need to care for sick relatives in Virginia. Said it was a blessing she had family willing to take her in when she found herself in a delicate condition. The quilting circle fell silent, except for the whisper of needles through fabric. Martha Hensley, Mary's aunt, and the unofficial leader of their group, cleared her throat pointedly. "Some things are better, left unspoken, child. Your cousin Ruth found a solution to her difficulties, and that's all that needs saying." "But surely the father should have been held accountable," Ilara pressed, trying to keep her voice light and conversational. "If a man takes advantage of a young woman's innocence—" "Ilara Gibson," interrupted Susanna Mullins, their hostess, her weathered face stern as she looked up from her stitching. "That kind of talk serves no purpose except to spread gossip and cause pain. Ruth made her choices, and she faced the consequences with dignity. That's the way of things." But Ilara had caught something in the quick glance that passed between Martha and old Mrs. Collins, a flicker of knowledge shared and carefully contained. These women knew more than they were saying, and their silence was not born of ignorance, but of something far more deliberate. Her next attempt proved even more frustrating. She approached Sarah Whitaker, a young mother whose husband traveled frequently for work, leaving her alone with 3 small children. Sarah had always been more talkative than the older women, more willing to share the small troubles and joys of daily life. But when Ilara tried to draw her into a conversation about the difficulties young women faced when men in positions of authority took liberties, Sarah's face had shuttered completely. "I don't know what you're getting at, Ilara, but it sounds like dangerous thinking to me. A woman's place is to support her family, not to go stirring up trouble with wild accusations. You'd do well to remember that, especially with your mixed blood making folks already suspicious of your family's character." The rebuke stung not just for its harshness, but for its accuracy. The Melungeons of their settlement existed in a precarious balance, accepted but never fully trusted, tolerated as long as they caused no problems and made no demands. Any scandal, any disruption of the careful social order that kept their small community functioning could have devastating consequences for families like the Gibsons. It was Martha Hensley's youngest daughter, barely 16, and already showing the worn look of mountain women twice her age, who finally gave Ilara the first real lead. Jenny had approached her after church one Sunday, ostensibly to ask about trading some preserved vegetables, but her real purpose became clear when she leaned close and whispered, "If you're looking for answers about certain troubles that run in families, you might want to talk to old Mabel down at Willow Creek. She's delivered more babies than anyone in these mountains, and she remembers things others prefer to forget." Mabel Pritchard lived in a cabin so far down the hollow that most folks forgot she existed until they needed her services. She was somewhere past 60, with iron-gray hair that she wore in a single braid down her back and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. The mountain people whispered that she had learned the old ways from her Cherokee grandmother, that she could read the future in the patterns of bird flight, and knew herbs that could bring life or end it with equal ease. Ilara had never spoken to her directly, but she remembered Mabel from her childhood, a quiet figure who appeared at bedsides when babies were being born or when someone's time for leaving had come. The path to Mabel's cabin wound through a stand of ancient oaks and over a creek that had to be crossed on stones, slippery with moss. Ilara made the journey on a gray afternoon when the clouds hung low enough to touch the treetops and the air tasted of coming rain. She found the old woman sitting on her porch, sorting through a collection of dried herbs, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "I wondered when you'd come," Mabel said without looking up. "Saw it in your face at church last week. You got that look women get when they're carrying secrets too heavy for their shoulders." Ilara felt her cheeks burn, but there was something in the old woman's voice that encouraged honesty rather than denying it. "I need to know if there are others," she said simply. "Other girls who found themselves in trouble with men who should have protected them instead of what they did." Mabel's hands stilled in their work, and she finally looked up, her gray eyes sharp and assessing. "That's a dangerous question, child. The kind that can get a woman marked as a troublemaker, or worse." "I'm already marked," Ilara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The only question now is whether I stand alone, or if there are others who've walked this path before me." The old midwife studied her for a long moment, then set aside her herbs and gestured for Ilara to sit on the rough bench beside her chair. "There was a girl, must have been 10 years ago now. Sweet thing, couldn't have been more than 15. Came to me in the dead of winter, belly showing, and nowhere to turn. Said her stepfather had been visiting her bed since her mother remarried, and when she tried to tell her mama, she got called a liar and a temptress." Ilara's heart clenched, recognizing the familiar pattern of blame and silence. What happened to her? Had the baby, gave it to a family down in the valley who couldn't have children of their own. But the girl never was right after that. Died of fever the following winter, though some said it was more like she just gave up living. Mabel's voice carried the weight of old grief. "And there was another couple years back, preacher's daughter from over the ridge. Same story, different man. Her own father, if you can believe such evil." "Why didn't anyone do anything? Why didn't anyone speak up?" Mabel laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Speak up to who, child? The law belongs to men like the ones doing the hurting. The church preaches about women being vessels of temptation, and families. Well, families got to eat, got to survive. Hard to do, either when you're marked as troublemakers." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of footsteps on the path made both women look up. Uncle Silas emerged from the tree line, his face dark with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. He walked with the measured stride of a man who owned whatever ground his feet touched, but there was tension in his shoulders that suggested he was not as confident as he appeared. "Ilara," he said, his voice carrying the tone he might use with a disobedient child. "Your mama's been looking for you. Worried sick she is with you wandering off without word." "I told her I was going for a walk," Ilara replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze, even as her stomach churned with revulsion. "Long walk," he said, his eyes shifting to Mabel. "Hope you haven't been filling this girl's head with foolish notions, old woman. Young ladies need to focus on their duties to family, not go chasing after gossip and stories that serve no purpose but to cause pain." Mabel's expression remained neutral, but Ilara caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Just chatting about herbs and healing, Silas. Nothing more." "Good. Ilara, you come along now. Your sister's feeling poorly, and she needs you at home." As they walked back up the mountain path, Uncle Silas kept pace beside her, his presence oppressive in the gathering dusk. "You know, child," he said conversationally, "there's been talk in the settlement about your family. Some folks wondering if the Gibson blood runs too wild, if maybe your people have forgotten their place in the natural order of things. Dangerous talk, that is. The kind that could see your papa lose his work, could see your whole family marked as undesirable." The threat was delivered with such casual cruelty that Ilara almost stumbled, but she forced herself to keep walking. He was warning her off, letting her know that her questions had been noticed and that there would be consequences if she persisted. But instead of frightening her into submission, his words only confirmed what Mabel's stories had suggested. This was bigger than just her and Lilia. This was a pattern of abuse protected by a conspiracy of silence, and Uncle Silas was afraid that pattern might finally be exposed. By the time they reached the Gibson cabin, Ilara had made her decision. The search for allies had revealed the depth of the problem, but also its weakness. Men like Silas relied on isolation and shame to keep their victims silent. But knowledge shared was power divided. She would find the others, the women who carried similar scars, and together they would build something strong enough to break the silence that had protected monsters for far too long. The plan had taken shape slowly, whispered conversations in the pre-dawn darkness when even the roosters slept and the world belonged only to secrets and desperate hopes. With their pregnancies now undeniable, their bodies swelling despite the loose-fitting dresses they had taken to wearing, the sisters knew their time was running out. Soon their condition would be impossible to hide, and then would come the questions they could never answer honestly, not without destroying what remained of their family's precarious position in the settlement. "There's a town called Greenville, maybe 30 miles northeast of here," Ilara had whispered to Lilia as they worked side by side in their mother's garden, pulling the last of the winter vegetables from the frost-hardened ground. "Jenny Hensley told me her cousin went there when she found herself in trouble. Said there are people who help girls like us, church folks who don't ask too many questions as long as you're willing to work." Lilia's hands had stilled on the turnip she was pulling, and for a moment Ilara had seen a flicker of something like hope cross her sister's face. "You think they would take us both, even carrying as we are? We're strong workers, both of us, and we could say we're widows, that our husbands died in a mining accident or some such. People don't question young widows too closely, especially not ones willing to scrub floors and take in washing." It was a thin plan, built more on desperation than wisdom, but it was the only path forward either of them could see. They began gathering supplies in secret, hiding away small portions of food, sewing what little money they had managed to save into the lining of their winter coats. They told themselves they were being careful, that their preparations were invisible to the eyes of their family and neighbors. They were wrong. The confrontation came on a gray November morning when the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the ridgelines. Ilara had just returned from the well, her steps careful on the icy ground, when she found Uncle Silas waiting in their cabin's main room. He sat in their father's chair as if he owned it, his long legs stretched out toward the fire, a canvas bag at his feet that she recognized with sinking dread as the satchel they had hidden beneath Lilia's bed, packed with their meager escape supplies. "Going somewhere, niece?" His voice was conversational, almost amused, but his eyes held a coldness that made Ilara's blood freeze in her veins. "Your mama found this interesting collection tucked away upstairs. Seems our Lilia has been gathering provisions for a journey. Care to tell me where you girls were planning to wander?" Lilia sat huddled in the corner, her face red with tears and shame, while their parents flanked Silas like sentries. Their father's expression was thunderous, his weathered hands clenched into fists at his sides, while their mother wore the pinched look of a woman who had been forced to confront truths she would rather deny. "We weren't doing anything wrong," Ilara said, setting down the water bucket with hands that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. "We just thought it might be good to visit some distant kin, maybe help out with their harvest." Silas laughed, a sound like winter wind through dead leaves. "In the middle of November, with winter coming on hard and your own family needing every hand they can get, that's a peculiar kind of helping, wouldn't you say?" Their father stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Ilara Gibson, you will tell me the truth this instant. Your uncle says he's heard troubling rumors about you girls, whispers that you've been keeping unseemly company with men from outside our settlement. Is that why you're so eager to run off? Because you've brought shame on this family?" The accusation hit Ilara like a physical blow. Silas had been laying groundwork, she realized, spreading carefully crafted lies that would explain away any pregnancy while painting the sisters as willing participants in their own ruin. The masterly manipulation of it made her feel sick. "That's not true," she said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "We haven't been keeping company with anyone. We've barely left this hollow except for church and—" "Then explain this," their mother interrupted, holding up a small cloth bundle that Ilara recognized as baby clothes she had been secretly sewing from scraps of fabric. Why would an unmarried girl be preparing infant wear unless she knew she would need them? "What have you girls done?" The room fell silent except for Lilia's quiet sobbing and the crackle of wood in the fireplace. Ilara could feel the walls of their carefully constructed world closing in around them, could see in her parents' faces the dawning realization that their daughters were indeed carrying children. But instead of concern or compassion, she saw only shame and fury, as if their condition was a personal affront rather than a tragedy requiring protection and support. "I think I can explain what's happened here," Silas said, his voice heavy with manufactured regret. "I've been worried about these girls for months, watching them grow secretive and strange. I tried to warn you, brother, that they were spending too much time away from proper supervision, but you wouldn't listen. Now look what's come of it." He stood and moved to place a paternal hand on their father's shoulder, the gesture so calculated in its timing that Ilara wanted to scream. "The truth is, I've seen them meeting with young men from the Hensley settlement, sneaking off when they thought no one was watching. When I tried to counsel them about proper behavior, they grew defiant and hostile. I suspect they've both fallen into sin with the same worthless boy, and now that the consequences are becoming apparent, they thought to run away rather than face their shame." The lie was so perfectly constructed, so precisely tailored to their parents' fears and prejudices, that Ilara could only watch in horror as it took root in their minds. Their father's anger shifted from confused frustration to righteous indignation, while their mother's expression hardened into the cold disapproval of a woman confronting daughters who had betrayed everything she had tried to teach them about virtue and family honor. "Is this true?" their father demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Have you girls been carrying on with that Hensley boy? Have you brought this disgrace on our family through your own wicked choices?" Ilara opened her mouth to tell them the truth, to explain exactly who was responsible for their condition and how their trusted brother-in-law had manipulated and violated them both. But before she could speak, she caught Silas's eye and saw the subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the look of a man who held all the cards and knew exactly how to play them. "Think carefully before you answer, girls," he said softly. "Remember that accusations made in anger can destroy more than just the people they're aimed at. Your father's work depends on maintaining good relations with our neighbors. Your family's reputation in this settlement hangs by a thread already, given your mixed heritage. One false word, one wild story told out of spite or desperation could see you all marked as troublemakers and driven from the only home you've ever known." The threat was clear, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had calculated every possible response and prepared counters for them all. If they told the truth about who had fathered their children, he would destroy their family's standing in the community, would paint them as liars and seducers, would ensure that they had nowhere to run and no one willing to help them. Lilia looked up from her corner, her eyes meeting Alara's across the room, and in that shared glance was the acknowledgement of their complete defeat. They were trapped not just by their pregnancies, but by Silas's web of lies and manipulation, caught between the truth that would destroy them and silence that would damn them. "We made mistakes," Lilia whispered, her voice broken and defeated. "We let ourselves be led astray, and now we'll pay the price for our foolishness." Their parents exchanged looks of disgust and disappointment, and Alara felt something vital die inside her chest. These were the people who had raised them, who had claimed to love them above all else, and yet when faced with their daughter's desperate need for protection and support, they chose to believe the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. They chose to preserve their own social standing rather than fight for justice, chose to blame the victims rather than confront the monster who sat smiling in their midst. "You'll stay in this house until we decide what's to be done with you," their father said, his voice cold with finality. "No more gallivanting around the mountain, no more secret meetings, no more schemes to run away from the consequences of your actions. Your uncle will keep watch to make sure you don't bring any more shame on this family." As their parents retreated to their bedroom to discuss the situation in hushed, angry tones, Silas lingered by the fire, his presence filling the room like smoke. "This could have been so much easier," he said to the sisters, his voice pitched low enough that only they could hear. "If you had just accepted your place, understood your duties to family, none of this unpleasantness would have been necessary. But you chose to fight against the natural order of things, and now look where it's led you." He moved closer to Alara, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the satisfaction gleaming in his dark eyes. "You belong to me now, both of you, more completely than ever before. Your parents see you as fallen women, your neighbors will mark you as sinners, and the only protection you have in this world is my goodwill. Remember that the next time you think about causing trouble." After he left, the sisters sat in silence as the fire burned low and the first snow of winter began to fall in earnest outside their windows. All their plans had crumbled to ash, all their hopes had been systematically destroyed, and the people who should have been their refuge had become their jailers. They were alone now in a way that felt absolute, cut off not just from help, but from the very possibility that help might exist in a world where monsters wore familiar faces and spoke of family loyalty while they devoured everything innocent they could reach. The weeks that followed their failed escape attempt passed in a haze of enforced captivity and suffocating surveillance. Their parents watched them with the wary suspicion of jailers, while Uncle Silas made his presence felt through daily visits that served no purpose beyond reminding the sisters of his complete control over their lives. He would arrive each morning with some small offering, a jar of preserves, a length of fabric, a handful of peppermint sticks, gifts that came wrapped in poisonous kindness and delivered with smiles that never reached his eyes. Each present was a reminder of their dependence, each gesture of generosity a chain that bound them more tightly to their prison. Lilia had retreated so far into herself that she had become little more than a ghost, haunting their cabin, moving through the motions of daily life without any spark of the vibrant young woman she had once been. She spoke only when spoken to, ate only when forced, and spent long hours staring out their single window at the winter landscape, as if hoping to disappear into its stark emptiness. Her pregnancy was showing now despite the loose clothing she wore, and their mother had begun making pointed comments about the shame that would soon be impossible to hide from their neighbors. For Ilara, those dark December days became a crucible in which everything she had believed about family, loyalty, and justice was burned away, leaving behind something harder and more dangerous than what had come before. The despair that had nearly consumed her after their capture began to transform into something else entirely, a cold fury that settled in her chest like banked coals, ready to burst into flame when the time was right. She had tried running, tried hiding, tried appealing to the better nature of people who had revealed themselves to have no such thing. Now, in the depths of her captivity, she began to understand that her only real option was to fight. The transformation began with stories, fragments of family history that came back to her during the long, sleepless nights when Silas's threats echoed in her mind, and Lilia's quiet sobbing provided a heartbreaking counterpoint to the wind rattling their shutters. She remembered her grandmother speaking of their ancestors, the original Melungeons who had carved out a life in these mountains when the rest of the world wanted nothing to do with people whose blood told tales of mixing across color lines. These had been survivors, men and women who had faced persecution and prejudice with quiet dignity and stubborn resilience, who had built communities in places where no one else wanted to live and raised families despite laws that said their marriages weren't legal and neighbors who questioned their right to exist. Her great-grandmother had been Cherokee, forced from her homeland during the removal, but refusing to walk the Trail of Tears, instead melting into the mountain wilderness with a Portuguese sailor who had jumped ship in Charleston, and a freed slave named Samuel, who had fought for his liberty with nothing but courage and cunning. They had found each other in these isolated hollows, three people with nowhere else to go who had decided to make somewhere together. Their children and grandchildren had inherited that same fierce independence, that same refusal to be broken by a world that seemed determined to crush them. "We are not victims," Ilara whispered to herself in the darkness, the words becoming a mantra that she repeated until they took root in her soul. "We are survivors. We are fighters, and we do not bow down to monsters, no matter what face they wear." The first act of rebellion was small, almost insignificant, but it marked the beginning of Ilara's return to herself. When Silas arrived the next morning with his usual offering, this time a small sack of white flour, precious in their isolated settlement, Ilara met him at the door and refused to take it from his hands. "We have enough flour," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Thank you for thinking of us, but we can manage our own provisions." Something flickered in Silas's eyes, surprise mixed with the beginning of anger, but he maintained his mask of benevolent concern. "Now, Ilara, there's no shame in accepting help from family. Your condition makes extra nutrition important, and I only want to see you and the baby healthy." "I said we have enough." This time her voice carried an edge that made him step back slightly, and she saw his jaw tighten with the effort of maintaining his composure. "Your father might have something to say about you refusing generosity from your elders," he said. But there was a question in his tone that hadn't been there before, an uncertainty that gave Ilara her first taste of real power in months. "Then you can discuss it with him when he returns from his work," she replied, and closed the door in his face. Through the window, she watched him stand on their porch for several minutes, the sack of flour forgotten in his hands as he stared at the closed door with an expression she had never seen before. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Silas looked uncertain, off balance, as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. The small victory gave her courage to take larger risks. When their neighbors gathered at the church for the weekly service, Ilara began to position herself near the other young women, engaging them in conversations that had nothing to do with their shared circumstances, but everything to do with building connections that had been severed by months of isolation and shame. She spoke of her grandmother's recipes for winter remedies, shared stories of her great-aunt who had raised 7 children while her husband worked the railroad, offered to teach anyone interested in the Cherokee method of preserving meat that had kept her family fed through the hardest winters. These conversations served multiple purposes. They reminded the community that the Gibson women had knowledge and skills worth preserving, that their heritage included traditions of strength and survival that went back generations. But more importantly, they allowed Ilara to study the faces and voices of her neighbors, to identify which women carried secrets of their own and which might be willing to listen when the time came to speak truths that no one wanted to hear. It was during one of these carefully orchestrated conversations that she caught the eye of Rebecca Collins, the youngest daughter of the stern matriarch who had shut down Ilara's earlier attempts at gathering information. Rebecca was barely 20, married to a man twice her age who traveled frequently for work, and there was something in her careful posture and downcast eyes that spoke of familiarity with fear. When the service ended and the congregation began to disperse, Rebecca lingered near the church steps, her hands twisting nervously in the fabric of her shawl. "Ilara," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard, "I wanted to say, that is, I think you're brave, speaking up for yourself the way you have been. Not everyone has that kind of courage." "It's not courage," Ilara replied honestly. "It's just the choice between fighting and dying, and I'm not ready to die yet." Rebecca's eyes widened at the bluntness of the statement, but something in them also kindled, a spark of recognition that told Ilara her instincts had been correct. "If you ever need, that is, if there's anything I can do to help, you should know that you're not as alone as some people would like you to believe." The conversation was brief and cryptic, but it represented something precious. Proof that the wall of silence surrounding Silas's crimes was not as solid as he believed, that there were cracks in the facade of community solidarity that protected him. Over the following weeks, Ilara began to identify others, women who watched her with sympathy rather than judgment, who offered small kindnesses despite the risk to their own reputations, who seemed to understand that the shame belonged not to the victims, but to those who had failed to protect them. The most important alliance, however, came from an unexpected quarter. Old Mabel appeared at their door one evening, just after sunset, carrying a basket of herbs and wearing an expression of grim determination. She had waited until their parents were away visiting neighbors, calculated her timing to ensure she would find the sisters alone. "I've been thinking about our conversation," she said without preamble, setting her basket on their kitchen table. "About the patterns that repeat themselves when good people choose to look away from evil. I'm too old to live with any more regrets, and I suspect you're too young to give up the fight." She began unpacking her basket, revealing not just medicinal herbs, but also small cloth bundles that contained items Ilara couldn't immediately identify. "There are things I can teach you," Mabel continued, "knowledge that's been passed down through generations of women who understood that sometimes survival requires more than just endurance. Sometimes it requires action." As winter deepened around their isolated cabin, Alara felt the last of her despair burning away, replaced by something harder and more purposeful. She was no longer the frightened girl who had tried to run away from her problems. She was becoming something new, something dangerous to men like Silas, who depended on the silence and submission of their victims. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, Alara began to believe that victory might be possible. Not the kind of victory that restored her innocence, that was gone forever, but the kind that ensured no other girl would suffer what she and Lilia had endured. The reckoning was coming, and this time she would be ready for it. The pains began on a March morning when the last of the winter snow was melting into muddy rivulets that carved new channels down the mountainside, and the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the thawed earth with stubborn determination. Alara had been preparing breakfast when the first contraction seized her, a band of iron tightening around her swollen belly that made her gasp and grip the edge of their rough-hewn table until her knuckles went white. Lilia, now 6 months along in her own pregnancy, looked up from where she sat, mending one of their father's shirts, her eyes wide with alarm. "It's time," Alara said through gritted teeth, and in those 2 words was the culmination of months of careful planning, whispered conversations with Mabel, and a steely resolve that had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and abandonment. This child would not be born into a world of lies and silence. This birth would be the moment when truth finally shattered the careful facades that had protected monsters for too long. Their parents were away, visiting their sick cousin in a neighboring hollow, a coincidence that Alara had hoped for but not dared count on. It left only Lilia and herself in the cabin as the contractions grew stronger and more frequent, each wave of pain bringing with it a clarity that burned away the last of her fear. She had sent word to Mabel the night before, using Rebecca Collins as a messenger, and now she could only wait and endure while her body prepared to deliver both a child and a reckoning. Mabel arrived as the sun reached its zenith, her weathered hands carrying the tools of her trade, and her gray eyes holding the steady determination of a woman who had decided to stand on the side of truth, regardless of the cost. She took one look at Alara's condition and nodded approvingly. "Strong contractions, good rhythm. This baby's ready to meet the world, and from what I can tell, it's going to be as stubborn as its mother." The labor was long and brutal, each contraction feeling like it might tear Alara apart from the inside. But she welcomed the pain as a kind of purification, a burning away of everything weak and defeated that remained in her spirit. Between the waves of agony, she spoke to Mabel and Lilia about what would happen when the child was born, when the moment came to speak the truth that would destroy their family's carefully maintained fiction. "When they ask who the father is," she said, her voice steady despite the sweat that beaded her forehead, "I'm going to tell them, all of them, Uncle Silas, Papa, Mama, anyone else who needs to hear it. This child deserves to know that its mother was brave enough to speak the truth, even when that truth was ugly enough to make people look away." Lilia clutched her sister's hand, tears streaming down her face. "They won't believe you. They'll say you're lying, that the pain has made you delirious. They'll find a way to twist it around to make it our fault again." "Let them try," Alara replied, and in her voice was the echo of their Cherokee ancestors who had refused to bow down to removal, of their Portuguese great-grandfather who had jumped ship rather than return to a life of servitude, of their African forebears who had fought for freedom with nothing but their own determination. The truth doesn't stop being true just because people refuse to hear it, and sometimes the only way to break a cycle is to be willing to pay whatever price it takes to stop it from continuing. As evening shadows began to creep across the cabin floor, the final stage of labor arrived with an intensity that left Alara gasping and shaking. With Mabel's steady guidance and Lilia's tearful encouragement, she pushed her child into the world as the last light of day faded from the windows. The baby's first cry pierced the mountain silence like a declaration of war against the lies that had protected its conception. And when Mabel placed the squirming, red-faced infant on Alara's chest, she looked into its dark eyes and saw not shame, but possibility, not a reminder of violation, but a symbol of survival. "A daughter," Mabel announced, her voice carrying satisfaction and something that might have been pride. "Strong lungs, good color. She's going to be a fighter, this one." The sound of footsteps on the porch announced the arrival of Alara's parents, returning from their visit just as the drama of birth was concluding. They entered the cabin with expressions of shock and confusion, unprepared for the scene that greeted them, their daughter holding a newborn child, their other daughter visibly pregnant, and old Mabel standing over them like a guardian angel with blood-stained hands. "What in God's name has happened here?" their father demanded, his weathered face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. "Your daughter has given birth," Mabel said calmly, beginning to clean her instruments with practiced efficiency. "A healthy girl, born without complication, mother and child are doing well." Their mother approached the bed with hesitant steps, her eyes fixed on the infant with an expression that mixed wonder with horror. "Whose child is this, Alara? What man fathered this baby?" The moment had arrived, the culmination of months of preparation and resolve. Alara looked up at her parents, then at Lelia, then down at her daughter, and felt the last chains of fear and shame fall away from her spirit. "Uncle Silas fathered this child," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "He forced himself on me, just as he forced himself on Lilia. This baby is the product of his abuse, and I will not pretend otherwise to protect his reputation or preserve this family's false peace." The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed to have weight, pressing down on the cabin like a physical presence. Their father's face went through a series of transformations, denial, anger, dawning comprehension, and finally a kind of broken understanding that aged him visibly in the space of heartbeats. Their mother simply stared, her mouth opening and closing without sound, as if the words she was hearing were in a language she couldn't comprehend. "That's a terrible thing to say," she finally whispered. "A wicked, shameful lie that dishonors our family, and—" "It's the truth," Lilia said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Everything Alara said is true. Uncle Silas has been hurting us both, and we've been too afraid and ashamed to speak of it. But I won't let my child be born into the same lies that nearly destroyed us." Over the days that followed, the truth spread through their small community like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and meaningful glances, until even those who desperately wanted to maintain their willful blindness could no longer ignore what had been hiding in their midst. The reaction was everything Alara had expected, and worse, some families turned away entirely, unable to face the ugliness that had been festering beneath their surface respectability. Others demanded proof that couldn't be provided, evidence that didn't exist beyond the testimony of victims and the undeniable fact of children who bore their abusers' features. But there were also those who found courage in Alara's example, women who began to speak their own truths about abuse suffered and injustices endured in silence. Rebecca Collins revealed that her much older husband had been forcing himself on her younger sister during his visits home. Jenny Hensley admitted that her cousin's sudden departure had been to escape their grandfather's unwanted attentions. One by one, the stories emerged, painting a picture of systematic abuse that had been hidden behind walls of family loyalty and community denial. Silas himself tried initially to deny the accusations, to paint the sisters as vindictive liars seeking to destroy him out of spite. But the weight of accumulating testimony and the undeniable evidence of the children themselves gradually stripped away his credibility and influence. He was never formally prosecuted. The law of the outside world held little sway in their isolated mountain community. But he became a pariah, shunned by neighbors who could no longer pretend not to see what he was. His own wife left him, taking their children to live with her sister in a distant settlement, and he ended his days as a broken man, haunting the edges of a community that had once respected him. The victory came at a tremendous cost. Alara's family was fractured, her parents struggling to rebuild their understanding of themselves and their world. Some neighbors continued to treat the sisters with suspicion and judgment, unable to separate the messengers from the uncomfortable message they had delivered. But as Alara stood on her cabin porch on a morning 6 months after her daughter's birth, holding the sleeping child while watching the sun rise over the mountains she had always called home, she felt something she had never expected to feel again: peace. The baby stirred in her arms, dark eyes opening to meet her mother's gaze, and in that moment, Alara saw not the shadow of past trauma, but the promise of a different future. The cycle of silence and complicity had been broken. The conspiracy of denial shattered by the simple act of speaking truth, regardless of consequences. Her daughter would grow up in a world where victims had voices and where the protection of children mattered more than the preservation of adult reputations. It was not the life Alara had planned, not the family she had dreamed of, but it was something more precious than either. It was honest, and it was free, and it was hers.